Tonight, I want to take you north to Canada and to a question that is quietly shaping one of the most closely watched diplomatic moments of the year. Because as the G7 summit opens its doors, Prime Minister Mark Carney is doing something that has caught a lot of people off guard. People who were certain they already knew exactly who he was. The very man who once stood on a global stage and openly challenged Donald Trump is now choosing every single word about the American president with extraordinary care. And the closer we get to that summit table, the softer his tone toward Trump seems to become. So the question I keep returning to tonight is a simple one. Why is Mark Carney, of all leaders, the one holding back? Let me set the scene for you, because the timing here is everything. We are sitting right on the edge of the summit. The leaders of the world's major economies are gathering, and Canada is the host, which means Carney is not just another face at the table. He is the man running the room. He sets the tone. He decides what gets emphasized and what gets quietly left aside. And in that role, with the cameras pointed at him and with Donald Trump just a few seats away, Mark Carney has decided that this is not the moment for confrontation. By the 14th of June, that restraint no longer looks like an accident or a one-off slip. It looks fully intentional, like a strategy that has been thought through and committed to. Now, to understand why this is so striking, you have to remember where Carney was just a few months ago. Back in January, this was a very different man with a very different message. He stood at Davos in front of the kind of audience that includes the most powerful financial and political figures on the planet, and he did not soften anything. He declared that the global rules-based order was over. He condemned what he called coercion by great powers. And make no mistake, when a leader stands in that room and talks about coercion by great powers, everyone in the audience knows exactly who is being described. That speech did something rare. It turned Mark Carney into an international political star almost overnight. He drew widespread praise. He upstaged Donald Trump. He became, in the eyes of many observers, a symbol of something larger than himself. That symbol had a name. He became the face of what people started calling middle power resistance. The idea is straightforward. In a world where 2 or 3 giant powers throw their weight around, the medium-sized nations, the ones that are wealthy and serious but not superpowers, can either bend or they can push back. And Carney, in that January moment, looked like the leader willing to push back. He looked like the man who would say out loud what other leaders only whispered in private. For a country like Canada, sitting right next to the United States, with a relationship that is enormous and complicated and deeply unequal in raw size, that posture meant a great deal. It told Canadians that their Prime Minister would stand up for them. So now hold those two images side by side. On one side, January, a leader at Davos declaring the old order finished, condemning coercion, refusing to flinch, earning applause across the world. On the other side, the 14th of June, the same leader on the doorstep of a summit he is hosting, picking his phrases like a man walking across thin ice, careful not to provoke the very president he once seemed so willing to challenge. The contrast is sharp. It is the kind of shift that makes you stop and ask, what changed? And the honest answer is that the calendar changed. The stakes changed. And Carney, who is by background a man of numbers and markets and careful calculation, appears to have read those stakes and adjusted accordingly. Here is the heart of it. There is a trade review coming on the 1st of July. That date is sitting out there like a deadline written in red ink. And right now, there are live negotiations on the line, real talks with real consequences for the Canadian economy and for ordinary people whose jobs and prices and futures depend on how that relationship between Canada and the United States is structured. When you have negotiations that are actually happening, that are actually breathing, the last thing a careful leader wants to do is throw a verbal grenade into the room at the worst possible moment. And so analysts looking at Carney's softer register have largely landed on the same reading. They do not see a man who has abandoned his convictions. They see a man who is protecting the talks. That distinction matters enormously. So let me draw it out clearly. There is a difference between changing your mind and changing your timing. Carney has not, as far as anyone can tell, suddenly decided that he was wrong in January. He has not announced that coercion by great powers is fine after all. What he appears to have done is conclude that there is a time to make the speech and a time to do the deal, and that this particular week, with this particular summit, with that July deadline approaching, is a time to do the deal. The conviction may still be there underneath. It is just that the public performance of that conviction has been set aside while something more practical takes priority. People close to the analysis have used a particular word for what Carney is trying to do right now, and I think it captures it well. They describe it as a nudge. He is trying to nudge Washington, not shove it, not corner it, not embarrass it in front of the world's cameras, but nudge it. Move it gently in the direction he wants without setting off the kind of reaction that could blow up in negotiations entirely. Anyone who has ever had to ask something difficult of a much more powerful counterpart understands this instinct. You do not lead with the confrontation. You build the relationship, you find the openings, and you apply pressure in the places where it will actually move things rather than the places where it will simply make noise. And that, I think, is the most important thing to understand about Mark Carney in this moment. He is not behaving like a man who wants the headline. He is behaving like a man who wants the result. In January, the headline served him. It made him a star. It built his image. It gave him a kind of moral authority on the world stage. But headlines do not lower tariffs. Headlines do not protect supply chains. Headlines do not keep a trade relationship intact through a tense review. For that, you need quiet rooms, careful language, and a counterpart who has not been pushed into a defensive crouch. Carney seems to have made the judgment that the quiet path is the one that actually delivers for Canada right now. But here is where it gets genuinely difficult for him, and this is the part of the story I find most fascinating. The risk does not run in only one direction. It runs both ways, and that is what makes his position so delicate. Because the very thing that helped carry Mark Carney into office was his image as a leader who would stand up to Donald Trump. That tough posture, that willingness to push back against a powerful neighbor was part of what propelled him to power in the 2025 election. Canadians did not just elect a former central banker. They elected a man who they believed would defend their interests and their sovereignty against pressure from the South. That image was an asset. It was, in a real sense, part of his mandate. So now you can see the trap. If he is too tough at the summit, he risks the negotiations. He risks provoking a reaction that could derail the trade talks and damage the economy he is responsible for. But if he looks too conciliatory, if he appears to be folding, if the man who condemned coercion at Davos suddenly seems to be going soft in person, then he risks something else entirely. He risks his political identity. He risks the trust of the very voters who put him in office precisely because they thought he would not bend. Looking too accommodating carries a genuine political cost at home, and Carney knows it. He cannot simply choose the easy path of pure friendliness, because pure friendliness would betray the promise that got him elected. This is what turns the summit into something much larger than a meeting. The gathering running across these mid-June days is essentially a public test. It is a test of whether Mark Carney can hold two things at once. Can he stay credible as a defender of Canadian sovereignty, the man who will not be pushed around, while at the same time chasing a deal that requires him to keep things calm and cooperative with the United States? Those two goals are in tension. They pull against each other. And the whole world, or at least the part of the world that follows these things closely, is going to be watching to see whether he can manage that balance without dropping either side. Think about how hard that actually is. He has to sit across from Donald Trump, a president known for his forceful style and his willingness to apply pressure, and he has to be warm enough to keep the negotiations alive, but firm enough that Canadians back home do not feel abandoned. Every gesture will be read. Every phrase will be analyzed. If he smiles too much, one set of critics will pounce. If he frowns too much, the negotiators on the other side may harden. He is performing on a stage where there is no comfortable middle, only a very narrow path that he has to walk in full public view, with the consequences landing on millions of people who did not choose to be there. And let me put the bigger picture around this for you, because it is not only about Carney's personal political survival. It is about what kind of relationship Canada and the United States are going to have going forward. These two countries are bound together in ways that are difficult to overstate. Their economies are deeply interwoven. Goods cross that border constantly. Jobs on both sides depend on the flow continuing smoothly. When a trade review is looming and negotiations are live, this is not an abstract diplomatic exercise. This is about the practical daily reality of how two enormous trading partners treat each other. Carney is not just managing his image. He is managing one of the most consequential relationships his country has. That is also why the symbolism of middle power resistance matters beyond Canada's borders. Other countries in a similar position, nations that are significant but not dominant, have been watching Carney. When he stood at Davos and declared the old order over, he was speaking for more than just Canada. He was articulating a frustration that many medium-sized powers feel, the sense that the rules they relied on for decades are being rewritten by the strongest players, and that they have to decide how to respond. So when Carney now softens his tone, those same observers notice. They see a leader testing the limits of resistance, discovering where principle meets practicality, and learning in real time how far a middle power can actually push before the cost becomes too high. I want to be fair to Carney here, because it would be easy to read this as a simple retreat. And I do not think that is the right reading. There is a kind of maturity in recognizing that the loud moment and the productive moment are not always the same moment. A leader who only ever plays to the cameras might feel satisfying to watch, but he may not actually protect his country's interests when the hard bargaining begins. Carney, by all appearances, is trying to do the unglamorous work of safeguarding a negotiation, even though it costs him some of the heroic shine he had in January. Whether that is wisdom or weakness depends a great deal on what he actually delivers. And that is the part we cannot yet see. Because in the end, this all comes down to results. If Carney's careful approach produces a trade outcome that protects Canadian jobs and Canadian interests, then the softer tone will be remembered as smart, disciplined statecraft. People will say he understood the moment, kept his cool, and got the deal. But if the negotiations falter, if Canada ends up on the losing side of that July review, then the same restraint will look very different in hindsight. Critics will say he went quiet at the exact moment he should have stood firm, that he traded his principles for nothing, that the man who roared at Davos whimpered when it counted. The judgment of history here is going to depend entirely on the substance, not the style. And that is what makes these next several days genuinely worth watching. We are not just observing a summit. We are watching a leader make a high-stakes bet about how power actually works. Carney is wagering that quiet pressure beats loud confrontation, that protecting the talks matters more than protecting his image, and that he can hold the trust of Canadians even while he softens his public posture toward Donald Trump. It is a bet with real consequences, and the chips on the table are enormous. The trade relationship, the negotiations, his own political standing, and the broader question of how middle powers survive in a harder, more transactional world. So let me bring it back to where I started, to that simple question. Why is Mark Carney holding back? The answer, as best I can read it, is that he is not holding back out of fear, and he is not holding back because he changed his mind. He is holding back because he made a calculation. He looked at the calendar, he looked at the July deadline, he looked at the live negotiations, and he decided that this is the moment to nudge rather than to shout. He is trying to thread a needle that almost no leader could thread comfortably, staying tough enough to keep his promise to Canadians while staying calm enough to keep the deal alive. Whether he succeeds will tell us a lot, not just about Carney, but about what leadership actually requires when you are the smaller party sitting across from a much larger one. The summit will reveal a great deal in the coming days. We will see how Carney carries himself in the room, how Trump responds to the softer tone, and whether that careful, deliberate restraint actually opens doors at the negotiating table or simply leaves Canada exposed. Those are the things I will be watching for, and those are the questions I will be following as this story keeps developing. The man who became a symbol at Davos is now being tested in a far quieter, far more difficult way, and the outcome is anything but certain. Thank you so much for watching our coverage on Mark Carney softening his tone toward Donald Trump ahead of the G7 summit. If you found this breakdown helpful and you want to stay ahead of how this trade story between Canada and the United States unfolds, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you never miss our newest reports the moment they go live. I will keep following every twist in this story, and I would love for you to follow it right alongside me.